with Max Verstappen admitting the collision he caused with George Russell in Spain shouldn't have happened, is that an admission that he knows his fury sometimes boils over and that will always be his weakness? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to dig deep into the 4 times world champions driving and psyche are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Nelson Valkenburg. Well, Nelson, we'll come to you first. Great to have you back, of course, Viaplay commentator in the Netherlands. So you're here primarily just so we don't get quite as many accusations of pro-British bias. So you're very much the token Dutchman.
I don't know whether or not I'm a good insurance for that, but we'll see at the end of this pod.
Excellent. But yeah, it allows us to counter some of those, but also, of course, a very sharp observer of Formula One. And great to have you back on. And Scott, obviously, we haven't heard from you about your view of the Verstappen incident, etc. So a good chance to get what you think about it and a bit more depth. I presume you were as surprised as everyone else with what happened on Sunday. Well, not surprised, but amazed.
Yeah, I was. I was watching it from home, so I was watching actually the Viaplay Sweden coverage, and I'm pretty sure friend of the podcast Janne Blomqvist's reaction was basically just to shout, which is a very Swedish commentary thing to do.
Just shout. A very Janne thing to do.
Yes, yeah, it's true. Just a loud noise, basically. Yeah, I was just thinking. I think the first thought that just goes through my head when something like that happens with Max is usually just why, what, not again, why, and then obviously each individual incident happens slightly differently, doesn't it? So as you see the replays and you understand bits and bobs, you see trends and familiar patterns, but no 2 incidents are the same. So good to get into it again a little bit more, especially after Max's rare comment on social media afterwards, especially as I can offer a slightly fresh British bias perspective after your unfair pile-on that was also not aggressive enough to some people, Ed, on Sunday night.
Yeah, maybe we did get some criticism for being lenient, but I must admit, for me, it was, I may not have expressed my position that well, perhaps, but I felt it was symptomatic of, as we're going to talk about, a pattern of Verstappen losing control when things pile up. And I think that's pretty damning. Just that fact in itself is pretty damning. I didn't really feel I needed to stress beyond that because that's a huge weakness and a huge problem. But anyway, we'll get into that a little bit more. But I think we should probably start off with what Max said on Monday on social media, Nelson. It's about as close as you'll get to an apology from him, wasn't it? He called hitting George Russell a move that was not right and shouldn't have happened. So what do you make of that from Max?
Tempers flared on Sunday. He cooled down on Monday, realized perhaps in conversation with the team around him that this one was maybe a step too far. And I was amazed at the Instagram message. As you say, getting an apology is not easy out of any driver, and also not from Max. So interesting, very interesting. And let's see whether or not the emotions keep bubbling over in the next few races. I think it was just a sum of many parts over the week that made sure that he lost control.
I think him admitting it shouldn't have happened is vanishingly rare. I agree it is as close to contrition or an apology or an admission he got it wrong as we will ever get. In fact, I can't think of another occasion where Max has said this. I think any kind of role he plays, normally he stands by it, doesn't he? He's happy to own his aggression, own his mistakes. And historically, you've seen with both Verstappen and Red Bull and the kind of people around him and the senior team management, there's kind of 2 ways of judging a Max incident. Either if they genuinely think he's not in the wrong, they back him to the hilt. And if they think he's in the wrong, they describe it as a racing incident. That tends to be the way that it goes. Like, it's never blamed on Max. So for Max to come out himself and say that it shouldn't have happened, I think I think that's telling. I think it shows that there was, I think Nelson put it well, that they probably did realise that on this occasion it had gone too far. And maybe some of that was stoked by the fact that there was some narrative on Sunday evening, not just from fans and people reacting to it, but Russell himself, Nico Rosberg in the Sky Sports commentary and in other places, that this question of whether it was deliberate. And I feel like Max had gone to some extent to kind of suggest that wasn't the case. I think he called it a misjudgment in the mix zone. He'd been a bit evasive in some TV interviews afterwards, but in the mix zone, he called it a misjudgment. So maybe he felt that he'd already taken a little bit of ownership and felt, actually, no, there is still this vibe that it was intentional. And I think, I mean, my personal opinion in terms of interpreting that Max statement is more him trying to really insist, I was in the wrong, but I got it wrong. I wasn't in the wrong because I tried to drive the guy off the road or deliberately just pile into the side of him because I was, pissed off.
Well, I took the view, because we got a bit of criticism for using the word misjudgment on Sunday night. So just to sort of emphasise my view, I think he did misjudge it, because I think he was lashing out at Russell, no question. And that's a big problem. But I don't think he thought, I'm going to hit him and do damage to his car. I think he just tried to do something a little bit leery to express his displeasure. He'd lost control, basically. It boiled over. He misjudged it completely and hit him. And that's terrible. That's a huge thing, a huge partly mistake to misjudge, and then to get yourself in that position where you lose control. A bit like the Vettel thing with Hamilton in Baku some years ago when he hit him under the safety car. It's just this moment of, red mist, I think, is a good phrase to use. And red mist is not a good thing. It's not an excuse. What happened before doesn't justify it. But I think it was just like somebody who was just in that zone where he almost couldn't think completely straight and couldn't control almost what he's doing in the car as much as he should do. So it was ham-fisted and stupid, and ultimately cost him quite badly.
Well, there was a couple of bits of data that I wanted to throw into this, actually, and I think now's a good time, just in terms of trying to understand a little bit about what exactly happened. And this isn't about determining intent or anything like that, and we'll come a bit more to that idea of how intentional it was in a moment, because I think it's key to the kind of discourse around it. But there were two things I wanted to look at with the limited data that we have available. One was Verstappen versus himself into that corner, just to get an idea of entry speeds and whatnot. And then the other one, and I know it's not a like for like because the circumstances of the race are so different, but the other one was Leclerc on Russell on lap 1, because that was a legitimate, hard but fair dive down the inside late into the same corner. Not exactly exactly the same way. So just very quickly, Verstappen versus himself. Obviously, we know he slowed right down. He came off the throttle. He actually braked a couple of times too. He'd only got back up to about 73% throttle before the corner. So it's not like he was back on full throttle and then piling into the corner into the side of Russell. I don't think anyone reasonable would have assumed that, but just to make that very, very clear. But it's important to factor in that because of that speed being so low, having let Russell by, he's never actually got back up to his usual entry speed to that corner. So braking later, taking more speed in, whatever, blah, 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 how it might look, it's not quite like for like compared to a normal Verstappen lap on the hard tyres at that final phase of the race. I looked at a couple of laps before and the lap after as well. I don't think he was ever really going faster or much faster. And this phase of the corner entry was actually comparable to other laps on the hard. So anyway, all of that is to say, it would be unfair to say that Verstappen was totally out of control or anything like that. But the trend of his speed trace clearly indicated that he had a lot of work to do to slow the car down, because his speed was increasing or at best kind of plateauing at a time it should have been reducing. And at some point there was a bit of crossover. So yes, one factor within that is obviously that Max was deliberately turning later into the corner. There was some degree of messing around going on with Russell. We'll get to that in a minute. So he had a bit more time to scrub the speed off because he wasn't trying to make the apex. That was very clear with what he did. Now, compared to Leclerc very quickly, the main caveats are obviously the Leclerc one was on lap 1, so incredibly heavy car compared to what Verstappen had later in the race. Tyres cold because it's the very start of the Grand Prix. Everything's a bit more awkward. So the cornering speeds are naturally lower. They're obviously down compared to what Verstappen was doing later in the race. But Leclerc's move was obviously effectively mugging Russell under brakes once the corners have already been committed to. But he's in complete control. He's hard, he's fair, and he's cutting Russell off as well. He's stopping Russell being able to come back. The key difference between the two of them is that Verstappen carried a lot more speed to the apex, obviously, than Leclerc was doing. And he basically needed Russell to bail him out of that move. So it was borderline out of control, but it wasn't totally out of control, Verstappen's going to fly off the track or anything like that. He's not targeting Russell in terms of flying into the side of him. He's just basically setting up a scenario where he's entirely reliant on Russell avoiding a collision, which obviously doesn't happen because Russell's been completely caught out by it. I just thought those were two interesting things to get a bit more sort of raw actual data on, because how you understand the mechanics of how the incident plays out, I think does go some way to defining kind of how you can judge what Verstappen might have been trying to do, what the intent was, what the consequences were, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I think there are two things here. I think Max is a very binary person, also in a sense very moral. Whether it's right or wrong in his eyes, this is what he sticks to. He's the champion of doubling down. The fact that he hasn't doubled down tells us enough. And I think we can look at it in a very simple way. He lost control of his emotions, and in that moment, red mist, as we all say in motorsport, took over. And I think he regretted it immediately, but he was too angry to say so during the evening. And then the next day is the next day, and the temperature inside the helmet has gone down. But it is symptomatic, I think, of the rest of the weekend and everything that has happened in the past few races as well. I think he just couldn't take it anymore. From everything that has happened in the last few weeks, maybe the entire season, he's been carrying this team on its back. They've been promising him by Barcelona, everything will be different because we're not in the wrong, McLaren is wrong. And then he is confronted by a McLaren that's as strong, if not stronger than before, B, a strategy not of his own choosing. The element in this with Charles Leclerc is very important because he was so pissed off with Charles Leclerc and the main straight issue, the contact they had. He was calling for Charles to give the position back at the moment he got the call to give the position to Russell. I think it was just overload, and I think he couldn't deal with it at that point.
And none of which justifies it, but this is about understanding. I mean, it is a weakness because we talk about that emotional control as a great strength for drivers sort of in the moment. We talk about Oscar Piastri having a big strength on that side of things. So I don't know about you, Scott, but I think that's the big Verstappen weakness. And if I was a Verstappen rival, I'd be thinking, well, if you can push him into that zone, then he can do things that are self-defeating, because that's the key thing. This cost Verstappen 9 points, maybe even slightly more, if he could have come back against Russell.
Yeah, and we've seen that side of him before. We saw it last year on a couple of occasions. We've seen it in previous seasons as well. And it is basically when those factors kind of end up piling up and he loses control of a situation that he was previously in control in, and especially when there's a feeling that he's been slightly stitched up by something the team's done, like the team hasn't maximised everything. And we know that he was, yes, I think that, as Nelson said, that Leclerc thing was a big trigger, but he'd already been pushed onto the rev limiter by the tyre choice for the final stint. Even if that was something he understood later on, in the moment, it was clearly something, he felt. It reminded me, we've mentioned Hungary a couple of times now across the post-race podcast and even in the recording so far, but it reminded me of Hungary and the way that Max was talking on the radio in Hungary when he felt like he was being left out on his own to salvage everything single-handedly. It had a little bit of that feeling about it. And when that happens, yeah, it's exactly as we've been talking here and have talked about in the past, where Max reaches the point where I think once he's operating, bouncing off the rev limiter, I think that's where he becomes almost sort of like predictably unpredictable, where you can sense that there's a bit of volatility there and it's going to spill over. And he almost loses sight of, the fact that it'll hurt him. He doesn't care about the bigger picture. It's about, in different scenarios, retaliation, retribution, or just lashing out sometimes in that specific moment. And that kind of comes down a little bit to what Nelson was saying about just can't take it anymore because there's just one thing too many happening. And I think he'd already felt that the result had been taken away from him there. And I would agree that with what Nelson said about regretting it immediately, because I think if that was 99% of Max Verstappen aggressions, he's not letting Russell pass later in the lap. And that's what Max did. He let him by again at the end of that lap. And he wouldn't do that if he didn't think, I shouldn't have done that. That was in the wrong. Whereas obviously you heard how much he was fighting the idea that he should give Russell the place back first time around. I think there were stages of contrition, basically, that Max went through, both in the moment and after the fact.
It is interesting that it was George Russell. It's maybe the only driver that can hit the nerve when it's so exposed, and also a driver who's made it a little bit his mission to take advantage of that potential weakness in Verstappen. So maybe the fact that it was George added to it. But yeah, just a very interesting day. And one he might regret later on in the season. We don't know how this season is going to unfold, but yeah, that's going to play a part in that as well.
Well, if you get to the end of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and he loses the World Championship by 5 points, then this is one of those days you could say to, well, if that didn't happen, because he did actually finish 5th on the road and he lost it to what happened there. So you could say he lost the championship there. Now, it's quite hard to see that scenario arising, but it's possible. And this is a weakness, isn't it, Nelson, that could cost him a championship. Do you think it's something that Verstappen can do anything about, or is it just one of those things that's baked into somebody's character? In the cold light of day, you can say, well, of course I shouldn't get into that zone. I will control myself next time. But then I think as everyone at some point in their existence will have had moments where just your judgment goes because you've been pushed by certain circumstances. Is that just where his line is, and it's going to be really hard to adjust it?
Well, let's turn it around. It comes from a fact that he refuses to budge, refuses to give way. And hasn't that trait also given him, for instance, the 2021 title? So in a net zero world, it might just be a benefit for him. Days like last Sunday don't come around too often with Max. The fact that we had to go back to Hungary and before that a few years before mean that they are only in extreme circumstances a weakness for Verstappen. And it just comes with the package, like how Schumacher was under very high strain, or Senna or other drivers. Everybody has their own vices, and this is Verstappen's. And it's not to make light of it. Is, I think, the fact that where it comes from is also a strength under different circumstances. He refuses to give way. That makes him the toughest driver to fight with on track. There are only a few who can deal with him. And on the other hand, on a day like last Sunday, it becomes a weakness. But yeah, I think it's part of the package. This is who he is.
And we'll come on to the way it was penalised and the wider issue shortly, Scott. But obviously, like I said, we had some criticism on this podcast for being too lenient. It's been a huge talking point. So what do you think? Is this a huge deal, what happened, or is it a bit overblown?
Tempted as I am to say it's a bit of both. I think it is more the former. But it can be a big deal that is also overblown. It's a big deal because of all the reasons discussed so far. First of all, it does point to a weakness in the way Verstappen conducts himself. Second of all, it's not the way a lot of people like to see drivers race. And it's also significant because, as we've discussed, Verstappen has himself admitted that it shouldn't have happened. So even he's realised he's gone too far on this occasion. In terms of where it's potentially been overblown, I think that's where, obviously, and yeah, let's save specifically conversation about what the penalty should have been or could have been, blah, 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 separately. But because a lot of people think it should have been dealt with more severely, and there was talk about whether it was deliberate and should have been a black flag, disqualification afterwards, whatever. I mean, that's where you potentially get into, okay, well, is it really as bad as that? That's one of the reasons why I presented that data before, because I think it's fairly obvious that what Max did was wrong, went too far, crossed the line in a few different ways. How much it crossed that line depends on what you want from your racing. But in terms of that alleged leniency on the post-race podcast, I mean, I've listened to what you guys were saying on that review. I think collectively it could have been a little bit more damning, but at the same time, it's not like you let Max off the hook and said it was just one of those things, doesn't really matter. But I think because some people were convinced it was deliberate, there was a degree of expectation that you would call for him to be banned, and that's where I think that sort of feeling that maybe it could have gone further comes from. But I think the key thing is we don't know exactly what Max's plan was, right? So, of course, there was a pretty big degree of intention to do something a bit crap, to do something unfair, to do something that most drivers wouldn't do. I mean, that's undeniable. But to what extent? John Noble said that if it was 100% deliberate, it should have been a ban. I think Mark Hughes said if it was an attempt to just wipe Russell out, that should be a ban. Agree with both. But in my opinion, Max was being over aggressive, didn't care if there was contact, and was planning to run Russell out of road. But that's not the same as deliberately just flying into another car and causing a massive accident or whatever. What he tried to do was very, very, very dark arts and over the line as in terms of what I prefer to see, and he got it badly wrong. It was rubbish, and I'm going to, for the benefit of the people that aren't seeing the video version of this, quote marks, it was just the upper end of unsporting driving. So I thought 10 seconds was lenient. I thought that should have been a drive-through penalty, for example. But it's not a ban because, let's take another Verstappen flashpoint. If you compare it to Mexico last year, the second of those incidents with Norris into the sweeps, for me, that's worse. That was more dangerous, more reckless, and more directly retaliatory towards exactly what another driver had just done to him. And that Max was in the wrong for because he obviously got the penalty for the first incident as well. So I don't think, and while I think in hindsight that Mexico penalty could have been harsher, I don't see why this should be a ban necessarily. And it's also one final thing, worth reiterating, that he is now on the brink of a ban. He's 1 penalty point away for a couple of races, and then he's 3 penalty points away for the next 3 months or 4 months. So you could argue that actually the licence penalty point system is doing its job for once. And that if you think Max should get banned, there's a very good chance now he will get what's coming to him.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. The only thing I would disagree with is that there was a plan in that moment. I don't think he had a plan. I don't think there was an outcome he was looking for. I don't think there was a thought process involved in those 3 seconds.
I think I should probably clarify. When I say plan, what I mean is in terms of maybe not quite in terms of a methodology and an idea of if I do this, then this will happen. But I think it's more that we don't. What I mean is that because there was no plan, you also then can't say that his intention in that moment was clearly to just fly into the side of Russell and take Russell out or something like that. So like the lack of plan kind of works both ways.
Well, I think it's difficult because you get phrases like deliberate. He was doing something that he shouldn't have been doing because he'd lost control. But I don't think it was like, I'm going to deliberately thump into him. Whatever he was doing, it was idiotic because it's well established that if you let someone back past, you have to let them pass, let it stabilise, and then you can attack again. So if he'd done anything to compromise Russell and then come back straight back at him, then that wouldn't have satisfied and there would have been the risk of a penalty, although obviously there wouldn't have been a penalty because stewards weren't going to punish him. So again, it's one of these things that becomes 3-dimensional, doesn't it? He was doing something and that aspect was deliberate to an extent, but the outcome, because he'd lost control and he's over the top, was not what he was aiming for. So in some ways, it's almost worse that it was red mist and a loss of control than if it was deliberate. Because at least if it's deliberate and calculating, you've been deliberate and calculating and in control. Whereas this is sort of edging into road rage territory, which is really concerning. There's no excuse.
Very interesting, though, is the fact that after the race, it came out that possibly he didn't even have to give the position back.
Well, definitely.
It
was in the dock.
A lot of salt to the wound.
Yeah, absolutely. That would have frustrated him. And obviously he didn't feel, because quite rightly, I think the stewards were correct there because Russell was in the right place and he had a moment and Verstappen had to take evasive action. So, just one thing piled on top of another. Well, Nelson, let's come back to the question of punishments. Nico Rosberg, I think, was talking about a black flag in the commentary. Apparently, I couldn't hear it, but that was one of the things he was saying. We've had listeners saying it should be a race ban. I mean, is Verstappen's driving a problem? And do you think the stewards are too lenient, or do you think that Scott's right that it was in the right sort of ballpark, certainly short of a ban?
Well, I agree with Scott that the penalty point system does its job here because he's on notice and he'll have to pussyfoot around the Red Bull ring. And Montreal, 2 races where you actually really can have contact if you go for it. So it's going to be very interesting. A black flag, no, for me, no. And maybe I'll get some flack because I'm Dutch, but a little hint of road rage in a fight like that, I didn't agree with it. I wasn't happy with it as during commentary. Right now, I can see sort of the funny side of it as well. But the penalty as it is, I could agree with. It was wrong. The fact that he actually admitted it puts a different light to it as well. If he had doubled down on Monday, this podcast would have been different from my side, at least. The fact that there is contrition changes the narrative a little bit for me, and makes it one of those things that we'll probably forget in 3 or 4 races unless he gets a race ban.
I think you could probably argue that maybe there was a case for taking the penalty one step harder. I wouldn't have objected to a stop-go penalty or something, and that would have been a bigger time penalty if it was added at the end of the race. You could say that. That's fine. I mean, Vettel in Vettel in Azerbaijan got, I think, a 10-second stop-go, didn't he? If memory serves, it's certainly a little bit more extreme, and that was a comparable incident, I guess you could say. But yeah, what about the wider thing? Because people start talking about the bigger picture, the past leniency there's been on that. Some people say Max has had lenient treatment from the stewards. Some people argue it's been harsh. So is there a wider need for the stewards to tackle all cases of driving like this more aggressively? Or is it just overblown because it's Max Verstappen again and it gets talked about and scrutinised too much because of his history and the reputation he's got?
Well, we have to ask ourselves what would happen if Franco Colapinto, for instance, or Oliver Behrman had done this. Would we have called for a race ban? Would we have called for a black flag? I think in the past, there is some difficulty in dealing with the aggressiveness that Verstappen has brought to this sport. I think he has changed the sport in that respect and the way it's been educated. On the other hand, the same goes for drivers who fight with Max. If you show him leniency in the fight early on in your career, you'll never recover from that. And you see that with Piastri now, he refuses to budge, and Verstappen has a lot of respect for that. So yes, I do think in the beginning the FIA has struggled to deal with the way he sets about the racing. It's not the way I always would have done it, but it's the way he does it and the way he will always do it. And I think the penalty point system gives you time to reflect on it and then dish out a penalty that is really harsh enough or lenient enough, depending on the situation. So right now, I think they're striking an interesting and good balance. And if he really feels that he is able to become a champion this year, he will have to be super careful from now on. And that's a penalty in itself for someone like Verstappen.
How about the role model argument, Scott? Nelson kind of alluded to it there in terms of how Schumacher's pushing things to the extreme. There have been drivers in the past who've done this, Senna, Schumacher. You can go back to Farina. You know, there's examples of drivers whose driving was considered to push things too far and people copy it, etc. So is there a responsibility to come down on it more hard to stop that role model effect happening? Or is Verstappen just allowed to do what he wants because it's down to every driver how they work within the rules, how they push things to extreme? Because this is, after all, effectively, I mean, it's dangerous, but it is also a game of sport with a set of rules, and you decide where you set your level of aggression within that.
Yeah, I think there are two different things within this. One is the kind of broader role model element, which you can't apply on a case-by-case basis. You should form your rules around what you want, what example you want to set, basically. And then you make sure within those rules you police them to the best of your abilities, so that when drivers are conducting themselves a certain way, obviously the rules govern how you want the drivers to conduct themselves. As long as they play within those rules, everything's fine. And then that is the precedent that you set for people watching, for drivers in other categories, whatever. That's the impression you leave. And then you, by policing those rules, if a driver oversteps, like Verstappen has, they get a penalty. The people that are watching that, young drivers, whatever it may be, should look at that and just go, okay, I can't do that. So the rules are, that's the kind of whole point of putting the rules together. It isn't about just ensuring sporting fairness. It's about what you want the idea of racing in your championship to be. So that's one element of it. The second element of it, which is kind of the sort of individual role model element, is trickier. It's certainly murkier, because there's an argument that drivers in themselves aren't role models, or don't have to be role models. Like they just are doing what they want to do. Now, some drivers take that responsibility more seriously than others and actively engage in the idea that they're a role model. But in terms of what they're doing on the track, they're not thinking about that. They're not doing what they do in the heat of the moment because of how it might be perceived by a 13-year-old karter or some driver in Italian Formula 4 or something like that. And I'm not, and this isn't a dig at Russell necessarily, but the mention of that kind of role model element afterwards was just an opportunistic little dig from Russell. I don't really believe Russell fully 100% believes that this is a massive problem, that Verstappen sets this kind of idea there, because I don't think that F2 and F3 are filled with loads of little Verstappens running around, crashing into people left, right, and centre because of what Max is up to. Like,
have you seen F2 recently?
Yeah, but that's different. I think that's because there's some incompetent drivers in Formula 2, rather than just because they're doing it because Max does it or anything like that. You know, that's just within the boundaries of young drivers learning their trade or just not being good enough. You know, one of those two things. So I think Russell was just being opportunistic and finding another way to put a bit of pressure on Max. I think Max made it very clear that he didn't think that much of the role model complaint. I think that was what sparked that next time I'll bring some tissues line, if people are going to get this upset about it, because Max is driving for himself. He's not driving for the bunch of people watching. And I think it's a little bit disingenuous when the role model thing gets thrown around, because that's an after effect, right? You set the rules. Drivers are individuals. They're human beings. They will see things in slightly different ways. So they'll conduct themselves to different levels within those rules. And then I think it's kind of up to the rest of us to interpret that how we want to. And I put it another way. If a racing driver growing up in karting or as a teenager in single-seaters or whatever defines themselves as a racing driver and goes about their business as a racing driver solely because of what one driver does in Formula One, then there are other people around that driver letting them down. So there's also a collective responsibility for younger people and the people around them to make sure that they're doing something, not just because whether or not Max gets a penalty every 6 or 7 races because he loses his temper from time to time.
I also find it slightly disingenuous when we're at a time where basically all F1 drivers currently as a default just laud the legend of Ayrton Senna, who was a great driver, no question. But he had his negatives in the way he drove at times as well. There's no doubt about that. Everyone's got that in them. And that's not to say that Senna was terrible or anything. But you can't kind of venerate everything that Senna ever did or everything that Schumacher ever did and then hold Verstappen to a different standard. That's what I find a little bit odd. But I don't know about you, Nelson, but to me, I feel ultimately it's down to the FIA. They're the regulator. Mohammed Ben Sulayem keeps talking about it's important they're a strong regulator, and that's absolutely true. But really, the stewards set it, and they've been put in a position where they've pushed for the guidelines, etc., to try and create consistency. There's all sorts of case history and that kind of thing that they're trying to stick with, and I almost feel that's made the stewards' jobs harder to actually manage things in a way that they would like to, because you're always looking at the guidelines, how they should be interpreted, and drivers are then sometimes, I think there are scenarios where you can fulfill the guidelines and your driving is bang in the wrong. But as soon as you do that, drivers can take advantage of it. And that's where I feel the stewards' hands are tied. So this whole role model argument comes down to the way that these incidents are dealt with and managed.
It just puts the entire race puts a further emphasis on the fact that these overtaking guidelines and rules just simply do not work in real life. And in Holland we have this saying, I don't know how well it translates, but a referee should be able to judge a match in the spirit of the match, and the FIA stewards are not able to do this, not in the way maybe we would like to see it, but yeah, they're not doing it for our benefit. But you can see a little bit of uncertainty with drivers and how rules are applied in overtaking. I wonder though, how did you guys see the Charles Leclerc running into Verstappen on the main straight thing? Because that could have, at higher speeds, potentially been extremely dangerous.
Well, they ran into each other, didn't they? They were both vying for the prime spot on the straight in the slipstream, not in the dirt.
Well, I don't be honest, I'm not entirely sure what Verstappen did wrong.
Exactly.
I don't see how that was anything other than Leclerc moving over on Verstappen. So I actually think there's an argument that Leclerc got lucky there, because I don't think he was doing anything particularly problematic, but if anything, it was probably just slightly careless. But I was surprised that, because that, put it this way, when the Russell Leclerc thing happened, the Russell Verstappen thing happened, and there was the steward's verdict. Unsurprisingly, the verdict there was that Verstappen was wholly to blame. Like, that was one-sided. But it kind of felt that way as well, but in reverse for Verstappen on Leclerc. So I didn't really understand that. But much like I don't think the penalty for Verstappen was appropriate, because that wasn't a simple case of, you know, an overtake gone wrong. You know, we keep hearing from the FIA, from the stewards, people that defending the decisions that get made from time to time, that no two incidents are the same, right? So just because 10 seconds is the standard penalty doesn't mean that should be applied to a situation like this. You know, Verstappen's not really honouring the let the driver pass thing. Not that he was ordered to by race control, so or the steward. So that has to be taken into account as well. It was a thing that Red Bull forced upon him, as we've just discussed. But even if you're saying that, you know, that this is kind of an unwritten part of the rules, Verstappen wasn't following that, as that's normally kind of the spirit of that is usually in force. He was trying to be cheeky, trying to be opportunistic, trying to retaliate a little bit to the wider circumstances, if not George specifically, and he was on the receiving end of it. He got something very badly wrong, caused damage, potentially caused damage to the other car, clearly gained a position unfairly. And even though he self-penalised towards the end of the lap, that to me felt like a situation where you weigh up all of those factors and you go, actually, do you know what? We're not going to give the guy a black flag because we don't know exactly what he was playing at there, but that's not the kind of thing that can be got away with. And to a greater or lesser extent, Verstappen did get away with it because he was still able to score a point. And if he hadn't given that place up to Russell, would he have got a harsher penalty? Would it have been the same penalty, and maybe would have gained another position or two in the final results because he wouldn't have lost that race time, dropping back behind, blah, blah, blah. So I just feel like that could have been a bit harder. That's the whole point of having a bit of discretion with the stewards, is again coming back to that point of what message do you want to send about your racing rules? What do you want your racing rules to be? And it shouldn't be about car positioning on a two-dimensional image when you're laying out the guidelines. It should be much more layered than that. And incidents like this are an opportunity to add another layer. Right, okay, what happens in an unusual scenario like this? Because what the stewards have basically said with that penalty is that right there, what Max did, is exactly the same as an innocuous wheel-to-wheel battle gone fractionally wrong.
Yeah, that means that at the end of the season, say Norris and Piastri are fighting for the title, and one tries to do a Senna or Prost and take the other one out, and he gets a black flag or 15 or 30-second penalty, they can fight that on the basis of what happened on Sunday. There is now a precedent. I think that's to your point, Scott. There is a precedent that something like that, which is clearly over the line, and it isn't part of an overtake potentially, could only yield a 10-second penalty. So it's becoming a really interesting and difficult web of rules and precedents that the FIA has tangled itself up into.
That's a great example of why you have to have flexibility in the penalties, because we had a few questions from the Race Members Club, for at least one. Apologies, I can't remember who sent it in, but saying, well, why? Because Schumacher-Villeneuve at her F97 led to Schumacher losing second in the championship. Why wasn't Verstappen thrown out, whatever? And it's like, well, the reason that was there is that was a line in the sand to say that if you drive like that to win a championship, you are going to lose that championship, which is why if we get to the end of the season, and let's just say there's a hypothetical penalty that's usually a 10-second penalty, and you're second on the road. I won't use a driver in the example because people just read something into it. Driver X is ahead. Driver Y is behind. Driver Y just needs to finish ahead or needs to finish with the other guy not finishing in a certain position, and does something that costs that driver or puts them ahead, and it's normally 10 seconds. You can't have a scenario where the stewarding decision does not factor in that context. And that, again, is the whole consistency thing. There is a context there. What are you gaining? The same with Russell when he cut chicane to pass Albon at Monaco. Yes, it was a more extreme penalty, but even then it wasn't enough because he still gained from it. You've got to take into account the circumstances, the motivations, and actually even the outcome too. And this is taken off the table for the stewards, and it's taken off the table for the best possible reasons, because people want consistency. Yeah, great. We can all agree with that. We can all get on board with consistency. We can all get on board with the need to make sure that people aren't penalised more for one thing. We can all get on board with the idea that intent and is important, an outcome isn't. But all of these things are complicated, and there's a different mix for all of them. And I feel the stewards don't have the necessary discretion to do that. But the only way they will get that discretion is if everybody, drivers, teams, people watching, us, everybody, is just a bit more grown up about it across the board. Because otherwise it just gets ridiculous. Look at Christian Horner's comments about, oh, well, the referee should decide whether to play on. Well, I'm sorry. The teams stopped getting the advisories from the FIA race control, from Charlie Whiting, Michael Massey, because they abused it. So they said, okay, you decide. And if you don't decide, you risk a penalty. And then they complain about it. And then they go the other way and the stewards do something different. And then next time it happens, they all complain about it because they will all push to get what they have. So that's my little soapbox rant about what's wrong with the whole philosophy of stewarding. It's not the fault of the stewards, the individuals. It's just the way that the whole discourse has gone. And the attempt to calm everything down and get everything battered into the same box means that we don't get necessarily the right outcomes and the stewards don't have the discretion.
Give you a minute to catch your breath after that, Ed. But in the middle of all of that, I would just observe, it's good to know that subconsciously or not, that the 2016 Formula E finale is buried in your brain somewhere.
Absolutely. But yeah.
When you were saying driver X and driver Y, I was thinking, do you mean Lucas Di Grassi and Sebastian Buemi?
But I commentated on that race, so
I would say because we know that, shall we say, our respective Formula One audiences are slightly bigger than our respective Formula E audiences, and that was now pushing a decade ago. For anyone who doesn't get that reference, just Google the 2015-16 Formula E season finale in Battersea Park. It is, it was quite something.
A very, very famous incident indeed.
There's one more element I would add to this. Did you guys see Toto Wolff's reaction at Viaplay? You might have seen Scott on Viaplay Sweden. The reaction was so telling of where he is in the relationship with Verstappen. He said, well, I need to see it again. I didn't clearly see it. There's probably multiple angles of looking at it. And I thought, this is a factor. If there is an apology, and it sort of came on Monday, this might be a factor as well.
Yeah, actually, he after doing a few TV interviews, it may have been straight from the one you're referencing, he came and did a thing with a group of journalists that I was in, and he was very similar, because he basically said, well, I can't believe it was road rage, and he was sort of quite sort of downplaying it. So I think I saw exactly the same thing, just in a different avenue. So he was doing it elsewhere as well. That's a relationship where bridges don't want to be burnt on either side for the future. Let's put it that way.
Time is running out to get 75% off a membership with us with our latest special offer on Patreon. It's a great time to check out the Race Members Club, including bonus podcasts and videos, exclusive behind-the-scenes insights, the chance to ask questions for our shows, community groups where you can chat with us and like-minded fans, and you get all of our regular podcasts and YouTube videos ad-free. This special promotion ends on June the 4th, so hurry if you want to become the ultimate insider. Just head to Patreon via the link we've posted below and enter the code RACE75 at checkout to claim this limited time offer.
Right, well, to finish off, we're going to answer a few questions from the Race Members Club that are broadly related to the topic that we're talking about. Scott, we'll come to you first. From JJ Cooper. Will this moment from today's race be remembered as a significant moment in Verstappen's career, or do you think it will fade away with time?
Well, I think how significant a moment will depend on whether or not he loses the World Championship by less than 10 points or something like that. Because there will then be what we discussed earlier, people pointing to this as something he could have done to have avoided that. But I think outside of something exceptional like that happening and something so specific as that happening, I think it will just fade to being one of the examples that gets given when people talk about Verstappen and remember him as, you know, the pros and cons of one of the greatest drivers that F1's ever seen. Because this won't change his legacy. It won't change the quality of driver that we remember. And actually, funnily enough, just to give a slightly different example, when we were discussing as regular, readers of the website or viewers of the YouTube channel will know, we've been doing regular kind of like what we learned articles after each race weekend here. And one of the things that we really tried to do in those is, rather than make them just kind of like, a list of 8 to 10 slightly disparate, generic kind of summary points, we do actually try really hard to frame them as a specific lesson. Actually be true to the kind of sell of the content, really. Like, what did we actually learn about this? And when I was putting that together, because it's kind of been my task to sort of draft the long list basically that we then all kind of refine. I had something about the Russell Verstappen incident down, but I remember messaging you about it, Ed, and then I asked a bit more widely within our team for some feedback on it, because I was like, well, what did we actually learn about it? We didn't learn anything. Like, Max is just being Max. Max is doing exactly what he's done several times before. So we've learned that he's still Max Verstappen. Like, it's not actually like transformative in terms of what we've done. As it turns out, that situation kind of got resolved for us by Max then coming out and apologising, which was something completely new. So we were like, oh, we can take the blame after all, which was a genuine thing that we learned as a result of it. But that's kind of a slightly different way of explaining my point, that doesn't really change a great deal about what Verstappen, like who Verstappen is, what he's like as a driver, how he conducts himself, and so on. It will end up being one relatively small case study in the tapestry of what Verstappen was like during his time in Formula One, unless it can be pinned as a decisive moment in this year's World Championship, because then obviously it will become the stick to beat him with, and it will be the moment that he lost the title or something like that.
And the next question, Nelson, I'll throw at you from Eric Bryant. Given that the FlexiWing technical directive hasn't wavered McLaren's pace in Spain, it seems to have almost completely quashed any reasonable likelihood of Verstappen keeping touch in this year's championship battle. If the rumours turn out to be reality, that for next year Red Bull and their powertrain division struggle with the 26 regs, is it possible that we've seen the last Verstappen title for a handful of years, or even indefinitely, if his well-publicised interest in other forms of motorsport tempts him away from F1 after a few frustrating years in uncompetitive machinery?
That is working under the assumption that he has nowhere else to go but stay at Red Bull. But it is a concern, and the concern is first the fact that Red Bull, Ferrari, and other teams really pinned all their hopes on Barcelona, and they got a really cold shower. Secondly, it speaks to the inflexibility of the Red Bull team in taking blame, at least for wrong design choices, it seems, and not
great choice of words, by the way, Nelson.
Inflexibility. Yeah. So there needs to be a technical directive within the technical department there, and if that inflexibility, that single-mindedness that seems to be there, leads to choices that Verstappen has no faith in for next year, let alone the engine department, but just the fact that he doesn't really trust the technical department within Red Bull to build a car that he likes, then it could very well be that he chooses to leave. Whether or not Red Bull will be a championship winning outfit next year is within our grasp at this point. I think nobody on Earth knows. Maybe Max has the best idea of where the engines are, because I'm pretty sure Honda and Mercedes have kept him up to date as they try to lure him away from Red Bull. And in the end, whether or not it's another title for this year, next year, I don't think he cares. I genuinely think he doesn't care. He lives by the day. And he needs to be the best on a Saturday and a Sunday. And if that leads to a title, it's one more notch on the belt. If it doesn't, he will not lose any sleep over it. But I will say, what we learned on Sunday is that he does care. He does care about the outcome of a Sunday. He's been so tranquil all year. He's been like, it is what it is. I do my best. If it's not enough, then meh. Okay. On Sunday, we saw he really does care. And that's a positive I will take from this whole negative story.
Yeah, probably it's the point where that calmness and tranquility, trying to keep that under control, just broke through, didn't it? So, one of those things.
And titles, who knows at this point for the next few years?
It almost doesn't matter, does it? Because 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 titles. I mean, the more titles, the greater the achievement in a way, but so much of it is circumstantial. I think what we do know is there's no question that we will see Verstappen in other forms of motorsport at some point. How that fits in with F1, whether that... I've always had a bit of a doubt that he'll sort of sail away from F1 early and never come back, as he sort of talks about, because I think your perspective does change as time passes, and what might seem like a good idea to do at 30 when you're 24 or something doesn't seem the same way at 30. So I don't know, but we will see him in other things. Now, the final question from Tim Walters says, say for the sake of argument that Red Bull determined the Racing Bull was the faster car for the remainder of the season, could Max switch teams from one race to the next and retain his points? Well, I would say the Racing Bull isn't a faster car. It's just not. But it's actually quite an interesting one regulation-wise, because there's a rule saying you can only use a maximum of 4 drivers in a season. Now, they would allow that to be broken in cases of force majeure. It's just basically to stop teams selling a seat on an almost race-by-race basis. But there is that rule. However, Verstappen's just one driver. So let's say there's a hypothetical scenario where the Racing Bull's car is better for 6 weekends. Could he swap between them? I don't think there's anything actually stopping it, but I do think actually F1 would say, if I would probably say, no, you can't do that, because then that would create the opportunity to, if you're Red Bull and you own 2 teams, they could create a car that's specifically focused on certain races and switch drivers between them, and that would be the problem. So I don't think there's anything in the regs that would absolutely prohibit it, but there are various catch-alls in the regs as well that I think would stop it. It's quite for me, it's a good example of why it's a problem for sporting integrity's sake to have an entity owning 2 teams. And I think this is the case in all sports. I'm not saying Red Bull's taken advantage of it, but it's a bit like we talked about with Carlos Sainz and the FIA presidency and the conflict of interest. A conflict of interest or a sporting integrity problem exists regardless of whether or not you act on it, because the temptation's there, the perception's there. So I can't see that one happen. Can anyone see that being allowed to happen if you did create that scenario? I'm sure it would be stopped.
I cannot imagine. Can you imagine what Zach Brown would have to say if that actually happens?
Yes.
We've seen the whole saga when Daniel Ricciardo took a point during a fastest lap run, but there would be a whole lot of question. It would push F1 to a point where Red Bull might be forced to sell off Racing Bulls if they actually did it like that, because then you suddenly unify the entirety of the other teams against you. So yeah, it would be fun though. It would be hilarious, and I'd be absolutely for it, if only to ensure that FOM just have to keep changing the opening sequence every weekend from one overall to another. But I can't imagine it ever working out in real life or in this counterfactual. I don't think so.
The interesting thing for me within that is kind of what are the, because I think there are downsides to whichever way you tried to play that or tried to police it. But what would be the worst case scenario if you did just say, if you changed cars within the season or changed teams within the season, however you want to frame it, you forfeit your championship points up to that stage? Because, for example, just as a completely left field and almost irrelevant example compared to F1 because it's on a completely different plane. Clearly, this is a much higher level than Formula One. In the touring car-based sim racing series that I compete in, you can change your car during the season, but you have to forfeit your points up to that stage. So if you're struggling with a front-wheel drive car and you want to go to a rear-wheel drive car, or you want to change to a different car, you can, but you abandon your points. What would be the problem with doing that? Because while you could argue that there might be a phase in which a driver that gets moved teams, for example, in the Red Bull ecosystem, loses their points up to that moment, at the same time, it would presumably be a disincentive for teams to screw drivers over and switch them around. So, for example, I mean, obviously it's slightly different with Red Bull and Alpine, for example, dumped drivers that hadn't scored points up to that stage. So Red Bull wouldn't care about losing Liam Lawson's points for the first 2 rounds of 2025 because he didn't score any. Same with Alpine and Jack Doohan. But for me, it would be as much as it would be a disincentive to playing some kind of games with a front-running driver to try and game the system, but it would also be a potential insurance for drivers that are under pressure at other parts of the grid from being dropped if you know that you're going to have to sacrifice points in that stage. For example, if you replace Lawson with Tsunoda, you would lose Tsunoda's points as well for Racing Bulls. Now, so for the second team at that stage, it was only 2 races, it's a small number, but it's still a factor, right? And then if you get to the halfway stage of the season, the likelihood is that you're playing with more points. So maybe you need something like that, just something very aggressive to stop people playing around. Because I don't think you could do that in a way where it doesn't impact it's not a substitute driver. Do you know what I mean? If there's a case of force majeure or something like that, you can judge it case by case. If someone comes in for one race The question would be, I guess, like, how do you know that they're only going to be in for one race, blah, blah, blah. But for example, let's say Lance Stroll can't do Canada, Felipe Drugovich comes in. I don't think anyone would say that Lance has to forfeit all of his points for that season, right? That's a specific thing.
That would be particularly harsh on Aston Martin, yeah.
I'm sure there'd be a load of loopholes within that, but that would be an example of the way that you could absolutely emphatically make sure that that couldn't have that kind of impact on a world championship level.
I think whatever happens is that they'd certainly stop it, and you might be able to interpret your rules in a way to say, oh, actually, every time there's a switch, it counts as a new driver under the 4 drivers thing. So there's definitely ways and means they could do it. Although, as the rules are, you do keep your points. The only time there's ever been a driver who's won the World Championship driving for 2 teams was Fangio in '54, because he was driving for Maserati before Mercedes came in. Although I did just double check the points, and it wouldn't have changed the destiny of the championship if those early points hadn't been taken into account. And that's not because of the amount of points he scored for Maserati, but because there was an 8 points that you had to drop under the drop scores later on that would have counted. So even though mathematically it looks like it might cost them the championship, it wouldn't. So that's the only case study I can come up.
Where you can absolutely imagine some kind of nonsense benefit to the 2-team ownership coming in would be a scenario whereby suddenly, like, the Red Bull Racing cars are unavailable for the season finale or for a round or something like that. They've had a specific shipping issue that has befallen only Red Bull Racing. You can absolutely bet your bottom dollar that Red Bull would look at that and go, right, well, can we get rid of Lawson for this one weekend in the Racing Bull and put Max in that car? Like, they would do something like that, wouldn't they? Like, that's the kind of...
Which I don't think anyone would have a problem with if their cars had somehow run aground on the Suez Canal.
They absolutely would. What a ridiculous thing to say.
Oh, well, no, you're right, actually, yeah. But for me, that would be a reasonable course of action that's acceptable, because I think a driver would wash up in that situation, getting a drive somewhere, wouldn't they? They'd find a way to do it. But yeah, I don't think you can manipulate it, and I'm sure. I mean, the good thing is that there's not a temptation to, because the Racing Bulls car is worse. And I actually think that Verstappen, if he jumped in it, would feel it was not a car that he entirely gelled with. He'd be perfectly quick in it, but I think he'd feel it would limit him a little bit. But so it's an interesting little thought experiment.
I would love to see it, just one session and get his feedback.
Yeah, it'd be absolutely fascinating. Maybe they could do it in Abu Dhabi. Stick him in the tyre test Racing Bulls car.
I can imagine him getting in that car for FP1 and going like quickest or second fastest, because there'd be 2 elements to it. It would be the fact that, one, that car seems to have a really accessible ceiling. Even if that ceiling is lower than most, it's very accessible, so you can get on top of the car quickly. And we know Max is one of, if not the best driver at doing that anyway. So you can absolutely imagine that combination having a mega peak early in the weekend, and then others would gradually overtake it because the car's got a lower ceiling. But that would just be funny if they did that. If they only did that for an FP1, and then that would be the moment where everyone just goes, "Oh, see, that car's definitely faster." But it would be because of something as specific as the way in which that driver and that car would go together early in the weekend.
I think on that basis, you should be obliged to do it just for the fun storylines it would generate. Well, thanks very much to everybody who sent in questions. We'll see if we can get some more later in the gap before Canada. If you're interested in the Race Members Club, you can click the link in the episode description or head to Patreon and search for the race, and you'll find out more there. All sorts of privileges, extra content, extra bonus podcasts, really great community there as well. So thanks to everybody who's involved. And if you're interested, look it up and you might want to join. And thanks to Scott. Thanks also to Nelson for joining us. Always great to have you on. Long way to go until Canada, but we'll keep on talking. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.